Hi, hello, and welcome. My name is Sara Hassan. I'm a writer, I'm a trainer and moderator, and part of GenderSAFE. And it's a great pleasure to have you all here today and be in conversation with Aoife Grimes, working towards a zero tolerance approach of gender-based violence in higher education. Hi, Aoife.
Good morning, everyone. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Sarah.
This webinar is organized within the EU-funded GenderSAFE project that promotes zero tolerance for gender-based violence in the European research area and supports research and higher education institutes in establishing safe, inclusive, and respectful environments by setting up comprehensive policies. Within the project, we are working in communities of practice on a model policy framework, and I'm sure in this framework, the implementation of the guide, like the one that we're going to hear about, is going to be most relevant, but I'm sure that it will be of great relevance for all of us here. Before we dive into our conversation, let me introduce today's program to you and give you a couple of notes. Today, we're going to talk about what a zero tolerance approach means from a victim survivor-centered perspective, what it means to give life to a policy with this aim, and how many different levers need to be pulled and people involved to work towards this goal. The first part of this webinar will be a conversation where we learn about Aoife Grimes's practice. We're going to dive into the framework towards a zero tolerance approach, a good practice guide to implementing safe, respectful, supportive, and positive, ending sexual violence and harassment in higher education. Following that, we will have about 30 minutes for a Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions beforehand in the chat already during the conversation, and I'll be happy to read them out loud later on. When we open the conversation later and you would like to ask a question directly, you can do that. Please raise your hand so I can call you. And remember that any intervention by participants will be taken out of the recording. One last note on housekeeping rules, something that has always worked very well in the community of practice that we've been building is that this is a respectful space, it's for exchange and it's for mutual learning, where people value each other's contribution, give each other space, and are aware of the fact that there's always the possibility that victim survivors are in the space with us. And so we want to pay particular attention to that. I'm not going to platform any disrespectful questions. If people are not following these rules for a collective learning space, we will have to ask them to take a step back. And if anyone should repeatedly ignore these rules, we would even have to remove them. I do not think that this will be the case. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page and in this together. And now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our great panelist, Aoife Grimes. Hi, Aoife. Let me give you a brief intro. Aoife Grimes is a researcher and educator with a focus on sexual violence and domestic, sexual and gender-based violence in Ireland. Her research interests include victim survivor-centered policy responses to sexual violence and state-funded support for victim survivors in the criminal justice system. She has a master's degree from the Center for Women and Child Abuse in London Metropolitan University, and in consultation with the Ending Sexual Harassment and Violence in Third Level Education National Advisory Committee, she compiled the guide that we're going to talk about towards a zero tolerance approach, advising higher education institutions in Ireland on good practices connected to sexual violence prevention. Aoife has previously held roles in sexual violence support and research in Trinity College in Dublin. She's currently based in Dublin and is working as an education and training officer for the Dublin Rape Crisis Center. Dear Aoife, hi, thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing your knowledge.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was so many mouthfuls. I'm so sorry.
There was so many mouthfuls.
Thank you.
We will hear more about that in just a little bit.
Absolutely.
Aoife, Can you talk a little bit about the Good Practice Guide? Give us a brief introduction to what it is, and maybe also touch on something that is quite obvious to anyone who opens it, which is that this is a very collective practice.
Absolutely, yeah. And thank you so much for having me, first off. And thank you so much to the GenderSAFE team for pulling this together. I think that the way that the GenderSAFE project works and the community of practice works really aligns with the guide and how the guide was created. So I think it's wonderful to be here. The guide was really, I guess, a capstone or like an ending of quite a number of years of work that started very much grassroots in higher education in Ireland. So there was a lot of grassroots movement around sexual violence prevention and response in Ireland. And like most things around kind of societal change, it can kind of start in higher education, that the processes become more solidified. And I think that's kind of really interesting anyway. And in I think it was 2015, the ESHTE project began. And this was, as Sara said, the ending sexual harassment and violence in third level institutions, or some version of that I always forget the actual words of. But it was really, it was a project between, it was Ireland, and then it was also other countries. So there was project partners in Cyprus and in Scotland and Lithuania. So that was really interesting. I actually wasn't a part of that. This was kind of before my iteration in the project. And they did really important kind of grassroots work around compiling the state of sexual violence and harassment response in Ireland and those other countries. And that, along with, I think, other conversations and important moments in the kind of the sector in Ireland, led to this understanding that there needed to be a kind of a nationalized response to sexual violence in higher education. Something that I always spoke about and speak about when I'm speaking about higher education is that it's not necessarily that sexual violence is only experienced in higher education, but it can be kind of, I guess, there can be conducive factors to it, and that's important. And I guess for us, it's more that higher education maybe is kind of facing it more head on than other sectors. And therefore there can be learnings there for other sectors as well. But the culmination of the kind of the work of the ESHTE, the work of grassroots people, literally people on the ground, data collection that showed that there was, I guess, a need for a response, led to the framework being published. And the framework was, as you said, called Respectful, Supportive and Positive Ending Sexual Violence and Harassment in Higher Education Institutions. And that was published in 2020. Maybe, I think, yeah, it was either 2020 or 2019. And that was really interesting because, I guess, and we're going to talk about policy documents today anyway, policy documents are like a time capsule as well, and I think that framework has been incredible. It has really kind of given a starting point and a push off point for higher education institutions and practice. But I know that it's in review currently, and that that's an important part of the process as well. It only explicitly talks about students, which is quite interesting. I mean, even when we're talking about policy, what we define as a student is interesting, because is it like an undergraduate or a PhD? If somebody's employed by the institution, are they so these kind of definitions become really important when we're thinking about practice. But the framework gave kind of a basis for how institutions could work towards policies. And the kind of the next phase of that then, or where kind of I came in, was the good practice guide. So it was kind of seen that the creation of the framework and the ESHTE project was kind of moving the practice in Ireland towards the next level. So sexual violence prevention and response managers began to be hired in a lot of institutions, and these were funded by the state. And the National Women's Council, who had been kind of funding and supporting the ESHTE project, saw that it was now, I guess, time for the institutions to take this role, to take this kind of step forward, and the people within the institutions. So the National Women's Council, who had done incredible work in kind of supporting this, in working on the ESHTE project and kind of funding it from their perspective or from their end, I began to be involved with that when I worked in Trinity. I was a member of the National Advisory Committee in Trinity College Dublin. And the National Advisory Committee was really similar to the community of practice that you guys have in GenderSAFE. It was people from all across higher education institutions in Ireland in loads of different capacities. So students, counsellors, professors, lecturers, nurses, people, just really everyone who met with and were victim survivors, I guess. So this National Advisory Committee, which I was a part of, the work of it had really informed the ESHTE project, and the work of it really informed the framework. So the Good Practice Guide aimed to condense the work of the National Advisory Committee and kind of put a capstone on it, and really, I guess, collect the perspectives of the National Advisory Committee into a guide for implementing the framework. I'm so sorry, that was such a long explanation. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense. Thank you so much for this. Could you just very briefly delineate, because I think something that I found so striking is how comprehensive this document is, and how this is something that I also found really unique, how it gives recommendations for implementation on all of these different chapters. Just for people who haven't had it in their hands yet, but probably will after this webinar, could you just very briefly walk us through that before we dive into it directly?
Absolutely, yeah. So the Good Practice Guide has different sections, and each section aligns with a specific framework outcome. So the frameworks from the national government had outcomes, so every section of the guide aligns with an outcome. And what we did from there was we took the various subcommittees of the National Advisory Committee. So again, like the community of practice, the circles within that, and aligned these with this separate framework.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this, Aoife.
Oh, sorry, I'm back. Sorry, there was an issue with my speaker. Is that okay now? It's
No,
better.
you're fine. You're good.
And then just to kind of continue on, so there's that each section of the framework has 3 specific areas. So it's got the digest, the practice, and a checklist. And that I think was really important for us because we're saying what we actually mean, the ways of getting there, and then things. The checklist is really funny because we talk so much about avoiding a tick box approach in this sector and how tick boxes approaches are not good, but then we actually have tick boxes. But what I guess the tick boxes are if you can see these things in your work, it means you're kind of working towards fulfilling the victim survivor perspective. They're kind of indicators of a base level of work that was suggested by NAC members that would be required to be giving the ethos and the aims of the framework kind of life. And then basically how we did it, or how I did it, was I met with the NAC and the subcommittees, I think 3 times for each subcommittee, and just discussed their specific framework outcomes, talked about what giving life to that would look like from the perspectives of the National Advisory Committee members. So I guess the freedom of it being a community of practice and having loads of different perspectives meant that we could advise different kinds of recommendations. So sometimes there's almost like contradictions in the guide, or rather explorations. Maybe it might look like this, maybe it might look like that. And that gives huge freedom from a guide perspective, because we're saying that actually the people who are implementing this know best, but this is what our perspectives might be and can kind of feed into that. Yeah?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I would like to come back to the contradictions or tensions between that in a little bit. But for now, I would like to come back to what you said earlier, that this was also very much coming from a grassroots direction to begin with. The guide, however, opens with a recommendation of placing a framework for implementation like this one in the hands of senior management. Now, I would like to talk to you about this tension between a top-down approach that certainly is very important to have senior management on board, but at the same time, balancing this with different actors that come into the institution with different pressures, who want to bring policy and policy implementation forward, but also just looking at the broad variety of stakeholders in an institution as such, and how to make sure that implementing a policy like that will be accepted, negotiated, agreed on by all these different players, towards something that we talked about earlier in our preliminary meeting, towards something that truly is a cultural shift. How do you bring that about? Huge question to start us off with.
Yeah, I'm like, how much time do we have? I mean, it is the question, really, isn't it, around policy and implementation, is the grassroots, the top down, bottom up. And again, there is no right way of doing this. And this was, I mean, when we were speaking about this in the NAC and the idea of the institutional working group, even like the name institutional working group, that was a whole point of conversation. What is an what does the working group look like? What does a working group mean? But I guess, as you say, it is really important for us and for people who work within the sector who care about what I call sexual violence prevention and response, but other people have different words for, that these are codified into practice and policy, and that there are people who have power within institutions who have ownership over that. That's super important, because otherwise things can't be responded to in the nature in which they need to be. That being said, oftentimes, if it is just, as we say, kind of top down, the actual on the ground practice of what is going on, the kind of responses that are needed, these are lost. So I guess we had, what we did, and in Appendix 2 of the guide, you can see this, is like create an example of what the different roles in a working group might be. So where they might come from, what representation might look like, and how representation might be created in a working group. We talked about maybe like the possibility of rotating chair people. That can be a really interesting way of allowing for equity in working groups. And I guess for me, and what was so great about the National Advisory Committee, is that it was unique in that people who felt like they should be in the room were able to attend. So people who felt like they had been doing the work and their voices should be heard, they were just able to come. And it was fabulous, because for that reason, we were able to capture that they didn't have to be invited. They were already welcome. Now, that's really hard to get in things like institutional working groups. So I guess what I would say is that there are always people who are already doing this work. There are already people in every institution who are trying to make small changes, who are calling out behavior, who are running their own campaigns. It might be in students' unions, it might be within specific departments. So try and find the people who are doing that work and invite them in. I think that's really important. The work is being done in whatever small capacity somebody has the space for action to do it. So invite them in and ask for their perspective, because they will know what's going on the ground, and they will know what responses might look like, you know?
Invite them in and ask them for their perspectives. I think that's a great one, on getting people on the ground into to the table.
Yeah.
But can you maybe outline a couple of strategies that you employed or would recommend to get senior management on board?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one as well. I think that we're quite lucky because, or maybe this was specifically in Ireland, and when I say we, I do mean Um, in this context, it was specifically the Republic of Ireland. I know now that the community of practice that is in place, which is co-share in Ireland, is actually cross-border. But in the initial phase, it was just the Republic of Ireland. Um, the Although we did have some input from NAC members. Anyway, listen, what there was impetus because we had a framework. Now that's really helpful, because the government, the funders, and the Higher Education Authority as well, the HEA, there was impetus coming from, I guess, their managers to say, well, actually, you need to step up to this. And we had ministers also saying, well, higher education institutions need to step up here to kind of respond to this. That's really helpful. And maybe petitioning specific governments can be really helpful in that regard. Something I think that also is really helpful is critical mass. So if a critical mass of institutions agree that this is something that they want to work on, this provides for that kind of buy-in on a top level, because we know that it's not true, but institutions, I think, when this work is kind of beginning, can sometimes feel like if they are the first one to say, oh, we have this issue, we're going against it, that they might feel like they're the only ones who have this issue and they're fighting against it. So kind of creating that critical mass of change allows for kind of the non-individualized approach, that it's actually everyone is doing this. There's a business case for this kind of work. That's not what I focus on. I don't think that's particularly interesting or helpful, but I mean, it's better monetarily for institutions to step up and create policies around sexual violence prevention and response. If that's the business case that has to be made, that's the business case that has to be made. And also, I think, and I was saying this to you before in a call, Sarah, when people are invited into the space, be that people in grassroots level or people high up in an institution as you can go, and they feels like it's something that they can make change in and they belong to. The atmosphere completely changes. When I was working in Trinity College Dublin, which was how I really began this work, the consent workshops were facilitated by one staff member and one student. They were co-facilitators together, and the staff members could be like the senior tutor, you know? So there was this equity of ownership over this issue that really gave buy-in, and it really gave life to the idea that this is not just individualized, it's a community approach.
Wow, thank you so much. I took a couple of notes here, how on the one hand that a framework really gives a direction to
Mhm.
different pressures that might come out of an institution, building critical mass, making a business case for prevention, and also having a sense of shared ownership for this job. So that is very exciting. Thank you so much for that. Could you, for people who are starting this process, are in the middle of it, are wondering how to move forward when it comes to implementation, could you touch on a couple of recurring challenges that you have come across, maybe before, during, I don't know if after is ever a thing with policy implementation? It seems like such a continuous process. But if you could touch on a couple of key challenges that you have come across and share your knowledge from that.
Yeah, and I guess for me, thank you, Sarah. It's not just my perspective, it's everyone's. So I would love to hear everyone's perspective on these as well, because that's what makes this interesting and that's how we can kind of advance change. I think that a big one is scope, which anyone who kind of knows policy and does policy knows that this is the big one regarding kind of organizations and institutions. Who is included and when and how, and what makes someone included, what makes someone excluded. Um, And that is, I guess, specifically a challenge in higher education institutions, because oftentimes there's things like on-campus accommodation. There's things like parties after hours, like maybe departmental parties. What falls within that scope regarding sexual violence and sexual harassment? Is like a part-time staff member who's subcontracted into an institution. Do they fall within the scope? Um, does a guest to a student accommodation, do they fall within the scope? These are really important and difficult questions. These are the ones that the more time you spend with them, the more complicated they become. Um, and I guess for us and in the guide, and when we were discussing this with the NAC, I guess we had the privilege of saying, well, actually, from a good practice and victim survivor centered focused perspective, the scope should be as wide as possible. Now, that might not be practicable in institutions, and that kind of is inherent in the tension. But for victim survivors, accessing whatever kind of justice they can and they want to, and making that accessible for them, that's kind of what we would say would be our kind of perspective on that, or that was kind of the next perspective. Um, yeah, I think the scope one is a really interesting question. And I know that you guys have been having conversations recently about time and scope and time. I think we're going to touch back on that later, Sarah.
Yeah, definitely. Scope and time are big and interesting ones. And I'm so interested to hear more about the broader scope. But I also remember that you mentioned two other challenges, which was legal and investigation. Could you touch on that a little bit? That
Yeah.
would be wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, the legal challenges are the joy of working in this area, and will be completely different for every country, because we have like an adversarial justice system in Ireland. Evidence collection is done in certain ways by certain actors. So for us, and for me, in like my capacity as a feminist researcher and also somebody who now works in like the Rape Crisis Center, for me, it's accessing justice for a victim survivor might not be through the criminal justice system, but it also might be. So giving a victim survivor the choice if they would like to pursue the criminal justice system, if they would like to not pursue the criminal justice system, but pursue investigations internally, if they would like to do both, if they would like to do neither. These are all super important. And I guess a big kind of area conversation for us was, what if there's kind of coexisting investigations? So something that happened that falls within the scope of the policy, but is also a crime. Does one investigation have to stop? Does one allow one to proceed? What happens to the evidence collected in the investigation internally? Is that allowed externally? All of these ideas around that are super important and have to be navigated on an individual basis for institutions. And again, what was really helpful for us was in the NAC, we had Gardaí, which are the police in Ireland. We had them attend and talk about what their practice looked like. And that can be really helpful as well, because everyone is talking about what practice looks like on the ground. But there is no kind of one right answer to the legal versus internal investigations. But it's definitely something that has to be looked at carefully. And it can be a real barrier for institutions because it can be costly, and it can be, I guess, can cause, issues around, maybe they would be worried reputationally about investigations. So these are all important things for institutions. And then I guess regarding investigations, the big conversation that we had a lot of conversations about was internal versus external investigations. So bringing in an external investigator versus using internal investigators. Everyone has different perspectives on that. Everyone has different perspectives on what investigations should look like, who they should be conducted by, what should be allowed to fall within the scope of the policy, who gets to decide that. These are the kind of the nitty-gritty, I would say, that can be difficult.
Yeah, yes, for sure. I would love to hear if you could outline some of the pros and cons of external versus internal investigation committees. Thinking of the constitution of an institutional working group, who should be there, who shouldn't be there, maybe. And I see you as someone who is wearing two hats here. First, as someone who could be from a partner organization, but also someone who is very much working within higher education. So it feels like you have a double role here that might be really interesting. If you could touch on that a little bit, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I would love to. And it's so funny because like I don't know the answer. And I don't think maybe we don't, and maybe we'll figure that out together. Um, the pros of internal, like using internal investigators from a policy perspective. And actually, I want to say a lot of the work of the NAC and my work around this has been really, it has been really benefited from specific work. And I think something that I really relied upon a lot was the book called Addressing Student Sexual Violence in Higher Education. It was by Clarissa Humphreys and Graham Tell. I'm going to send in the link to it in a minute. But this was really helpful around kind of navigating these specific policy issues. And there's a lot of other good work in this area. The pros of internal investigators are things like the knowledge stays within the institution. So the knowledge of what goes on and how it goes on stays within the institution. If you bring in an external investigator, that knowledge can dissipate and get lost. And not only that, they might not have specific perspectives on the nuance of how the institution itself works versus people who are internally based within the institution. And turnover of knowledge is such a big problem in higher education institutions generally. So if you're bringing in an external investigator and they're speaking to people who have never actually maybe worked on a report before, it's all of these things that mean that the kind of investigation that happens for one incident might look completely different to the kind of investigation that happens for another, even if the policy has been the same. External investigators are really expensive. Generally, I would say, and they have to be brought in on a case-by-case basis. But internal investigators are inherently biased. They might be biased towards the institution. They might be biased towards the individual involved. Oh, thank you, Lush. They might be biased towards the individual involved, and they might also be directly involved in the incident. That's something that you have to think about as well. If it's not a role but a named person, then they might be directly involved. If it's a role, they might also be involved. And from a victim survivor's perspective, we have to think about what we actually mean when we say a trauma-informed approach. Something that can be really helpful when we say that is one person, one story, one time, that a victim survivor doesn't have to keep telling their story over and over again to different committees, to different people. Victim survivors feel so much blame and shame. That's kind of the overarching thing that we hear again and again from victim survivors, that they feel like they themselves are at fault and they themselves are being shamed. And asking them to sit in front of a committee and tell their story, first to see if it falls within the scope of the policy, then to see from an investigation perspective, a victim survivor is going to see that, well, I can't speak for victim survivors, but this could be construed as shame and disbelief and doubt. And if they have to do that internally and then also do that to the police, if they choose to go that route, and then also the person they're sitting across from might be a professor that they have for a biology lecture later on in the afternoon. There's just a lot of tensions there. It's really difficult to know because we know that allegations have to be investigated. But, and I hate the word allegations as well, reports have to be investigated. But kind of navigating how to do that. Again, it's individualized. Maybe it's external investigations for one and internal investigations for another. We would say, though, that the panel approach for investigations, that was something that we talked a lot about in the NAC. The panel can be helpful because it's different opinions and it's less on one person, but it can become dissipated. It can feel like people don't have ownership. It can also feel like, as I say, an interrogation. So we would say while panels can be good, they should also be limited. So 3 versus 7, you know. Sorry, is that me feel like I'm making more holes. Sorry,
No, no, no,
Sarah.
no, not at all. It feels like I found it so interesting how you were balancing institutional memory against institutional bias and understanding. So there's like one person, one story, one time paradigm, I think just makes so much sense. We're going to touch on time and how that can put a strain on victim survivors and institutional reporting settings as well in just a little bit. But I found that very instructive to seeing what the different considerations should be for each decision, and that a panel might indeed actually be a way to balance those two without dissipating ownership, focus, etc. So that is so interesting. Thank you so much for this, Aoife. I think something that is really important when we're talking about all of these different actors, internally, externally, is the chapter in the guide on partnership structure. You're talking about different experts working in broadly in gender-based violence and different levels who should be considered experts in advisory roles. And in the guide, there is a recommendation that this isn't just a unidirectional relationship where an institution might send a reporting party to an external party, but indeed that this is about creating mutually beneficial relationship that has benefits, that has lines of communication, that has learning or resource-based interests for these third parties. Could you now give us a little bit of an insight of what that might look like as an external player within the Dublin Rape Crisis Center, and what you would recommend such a mutual relationship should ideally look like?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'm employed within the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre, but I'm not speaking on their behalf, just to kind of say that. But from my perspective, around, because I don't want to speak for anyone. Um, and I think that the Dublin Rape Crisis Centre as well is something that we really do try to work on. And that people come to us and we kind of build that mutual collaboration. And it's such an exciting way to build mutual collaboration through an external agency. Um, but I guess speaking in specifically around this idea of partnerships and the chapter in the guide on partnerships, what makes this like difficult but also really exciting is that there's not one way to create meaningful collaboration. It's always going to be different. Um, External agencies like rape crisis centers, like specific organizations who work with marginalized communities, they provide the kind of perspective that institutions just aren't going to be able to get themselves. But they are also underfunded, under-resourced, and they need our support. So that's why I think the mutually beneficial relationship is really important. Oftentimes, institutions might bring in people kind of towards the end of a process and say, from your position, how does this policy look? Which is good, and that's an important part of the role, but also, is there maybe training capacity there? Could they come in and give training? Could they come in and speak to your staff? Could they come in and speak to your students? It's about, could they sit on one of your committees? I know that like that's a really great thing that we do as well, as we sit on committees as external partners. And what's really great about that is that institutions and external service providers, be they agencies, organizations, NGOs, charities, they have different perspectives, and that's okay. So the institution has to have its perspective, and that's really important. They can't necessarily be as completely victim survivor focused as a rape crisis center can be, but they will allow the institutions to navigate that a bit better because they can bring in that perspective a little bit more using these external agencies. I guess what would be important is, rather than just like, as you say, Sarah, sending people to external agencies for support, is kind of building that mutual collaboration. So that might be maybe making them a charity partner for a year, saying that we are using or we're sending people to these people, so we want to support them fiscally. But moreover than just fiscal, which is super important, money is very important. Speak to the service provider or the organization about what they need. They might need a boardroom twice a month to have their meetings. You might be able to provide that space. They might need help on ethics approval. Maybe they want to collaborate on research. Maybe there's a research that's going on in your institution that could benefit from their perspective. Maybe you could allow them to have ethics approval or bring them through the ethics process. Meaningful collaboration is different. And meeting them where they're at and say, what do you guys need from us? Do you want to use our catering facilities? Does a childcare group need a space? These are things that allow the institution to say that we respect the work that you're doing in its different capacities and we want to help build that. And an annual review on like what meaningful collaboration can look like is also really helpful because the needs of external parties change all the time.
Wow, thank you. I feel like that is such an incredible insight and probably something that people don't really think about when they just broadly touch on who could be a partner organization. So I feel like that is really, for me, definitely a game changer of thinking about this not as a like transactional thing, but something that is very much mutually beneficial. And
Yeah.
yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to come back to what you said earlier about broad scope. And I think that is something that we within GenderSAFE are trying to wrap our heads around in the communities of practice often. But I believe that many people here in this space and in general are, and this is a towards zero tolerance approach that does indeed take into consideration where the problem begins. So thinking about early transgressions that maybe often fly under the radar of HR or even definitions of gender-based violence. So what does it mean to include, take note, record these instances towards a zero tolerance approach. What is your experience with that, thinking about a broad scope, and how does it work to put this into practice?
Yeah, I mean, that the zero tolerance idea is really difficult. Um, is that better now? I guess when I was thinking about this and I was thinking about our conversation today, I was reading your guys's the GenderSAFE report from 2024 on zero tolerance approaches, which was so interesting. And I thought it was interesting how you talked about there was no definitional responses in some cases, and that this can be good and bad. I think that the concept of zero tolerance policies versus zero tolerance approaches are different. You're never going to have a completely zero tolerance policy because, as you say, these kind of what are sometimes called like low level transgressions, they can never fit within the scope of a policy because, as you say, they're maybe not even words, maybe they're not even actions, maybe they're feelings. And that's really important from a victim survivor perspective because impact isn't necessarily tangible. Maybe it's microaggressions. How do we fit these within policies? How do we fit them within policies when they're constantly changing? I would say that maybe there's no policies yet in the world that have covered AI fake images of image-based sexual abuse. But that doesn't mean that they're not impactful and that they're not a form of harassment and violence. So I guess it's about moving to impact. It's about the prevention of impact, looking from the victim survivor perspective on how do we prevent the impact of the behaviors rather than trying to focus on the specific behaviors. And I guess zero tolerance also, we have to think about what it means to a community. How do we, sorry, did you want to say something there, Sarah?
No, I was just caught up on what you said on moving towards impact. And I think that this would lead me to the question of what it means to define really robust rights for victim survivors. I didn't want to cut you off because I found that so interesting, but that was just something that I immediately caught on.
Yeah, yeah, and the right to live peaceably and the right to not be impacted.
Mhm.
If we think about it from that perspective, it moves away from this quite individualized, specific behaviors. This is right, this is wrong. Whenever I give consent workshops to young people, they're always like, okay, but what exactly can I do that's legal versus illegal? And that's not what we focus on. That's not what we want to focus on. We want to focus on broad behaviors and building like ethical sexual citizenship and ethical communities. And I guess the towards a zero tolerance approach means that in a way the community is almost self-regulating on like on the lower level impacts because the behaviors that cause impact are less tolerated. Does that make sense that the toleration within the community is lower? And it also means, and this is really important, that there's not an impetus on a victim survivor to make a report every single time because that's work and that's energy and that's draining and that's compiling all of the reasons that maybe they have been impacted. It doesn't mean just because a report wasn't made doesn't mean it wasn't impactful. I think there's a really interesting approach in Ireland. They have the Speak Out tool, which allows for anonymous disclosures of sexual violence and also other forms of harassment in higher education, which maybe seems counterintuitive because what does an anonymous report do? But what does an anonymous report do means that it's put somewhere, that it's recorded, that it contributes towards the data, it contributes towards this is actually happening even on low levels. And that can be a form of justice for victim survivors. So when we think about zero tolerance, we need to think about impact and we need to think about forms of justice, I think. Yeah.
Wow, thank you so much for this. I feel like this is probably going wide beyond any scope of a policy. And what you were talking about is much more also um, pushing towards what we touched on earlier, cultural shift, but at the same time have a time sensitivity to it, which means staying current and understanding the different forms that these issues might take, and taking that into consideration. So I think that is really interesting to think about these layers. And now I would,
Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
no,
Just
no,
going to
go
say
ahead.
around the staying current, that's where grassroots comes in. That's where it's really important to talk to the first years because they know more about what's going on than anyone.
Yeah,
And
yes.
the people in student accommodation, they can tell you way faster than you can ever find in a research paper about what is actually happening. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. And on a note of time,
Mm,
I would like to unpack that a little bit. We recently had a really great input by one of our participants who has been doing work on non-disclosure agreements and the
mm,
notion of the rush, and how victim survivors who report are often under duress to
mhm,
sign an agreement as such, which is often in stark contrast to how excruciatingly long these processes might take when victim survivors report an incident.
mm,
I wanted to ask you, on your perspective of what it means to structure time along the lines of victim survivors' rights and interests, thinking
mm.
about impact, and how you solved that when you were writing the part in the good practice guide on the length of the investigative process.
Yeah, I don't think we solved it, but we definitely had a lot of conversations about it. Time is so interesting regarding policies, and it does go to scope as well. How long after a report, after something happens, can a report be made? And from a victim survivor's perspective, there shouldn't be any time limit. And I know when we were discussing this the last day, Sarah, I was talking about how, Sarah, excuse me, I was talking about how the idea of, oh, you have to report within 6 months or a year of an incident for it to be allowed to take to be investigated, that creates and enshrines in a policy rape myths. Um, the rape myth that if something isn't reported immediately, it didn't happen. Whereas actually, if we think about trauma and how trauma works, somebody might not have capacity to make a report for a really long time, but that doesn't mean that it didn't happen and it wasn't impactful. In fact, it might be more impactful on the specific person. So if a policy says, oh, if you didn't make a report within 6 months, you're not allowed to, then a victim survivor reads that as, oh, it couldn't have happened to me. Or they might read it as that, or it couldn't have been impactful. Um, so from a victim survivor focused perspective, we would always say that it should be as long as possible and it should allow to take place, even if that means that all of the evidence is gone and an investigation can't take place. That's okay. Have a conversation about that. But giving scope within the policy to say, if this happened to you and you want to come forward, we welcome that. That's so powerful from a victim survivor perspective. Um, there is an inherent tension in institutions because institutions need to have time limits for things. So that's where the inherent tensions come in. And that's where policies around sexual violence prevention and response might have to look a little bit different than other policies because of the actual specific needs. I would say that institutions maybe look at, if you feel like you need to have time limits, look at why you feel like you need to have time limits and how that can be aligned with the needs of victim survivors. Um, Maybe there needs to be time limits on actual investigations. So an investigation can only take this long, but actually it can have happened any amount of time ago. As you say, non-disclosure agreements are a whole nother kettle of fish and super interesting. And yeah, listen, lots of perspectives on that. But what we would say around investigations can take a really long time. And if somebody is, for example, only in an institution for a year, then, and if the incident happened 6 months into their time in an institution, that investigative process might go on a lot longer than when they are still a member of the institution. So that has to be regarded in scope as well. Um, Investigations do sometimes have to take a long time, but again, it's about figuring out why and how that can be alleviated and the importance of that being alleviated. communication can go a long way into alleviating the burden on victim survivors. So maybe saying that there has to be a meeting with the victim survivor if they want it, not that maybe they don't want it, but there has to be a meeting with the victim survivor every 2 weeks to update them on the status of the investigation. That even if there is no update, that's still a communication with them and saying that we are still listening to you, we still are hearing you, and we still believe that you were able to make a report. I would say we still believe you, but obviously they can't say that in that specific capacity. And something that also is really important are intermediary measures. And this is something that we talk about in the guide quite a bit. Intermediary measures that can be put in place while an investigation is ongoing. These do not mean that anyone is culpable. They do not mean that an investigation was founded or unfounded, or rather a report was founded or unfounded. But it provides for safety for the victim survivor and I guess also the responding party. That there is, maybe they are being provided for in a different section of the student accommodation. Maybe there's a different library they can attend. Maybe they can attend some of their classes online and the respondent can attend some of their classes online. So it's about balancing it as well between the victim survivor and the respondent so that it is not just on the victim survivor to pick up all of the pieces while a report is being made. Is that helpful? Sorry, I don't even know if I actually clarified anything there.
No, this was so helpful. Thank you. I think you really deciphered these two different timelines. On the one hand, for institutions, institutional investigations, and their own timeline that should be kept as short as humanly possible, with regular updates to ensure transparency, accountability, for victim survivors to know what exactly is going on. And on the other side, to make it as long as possible, so that people can report. And I think that is also very much taking into account that an experience of gender-based violence can just create a tunnel vision that will not allow people to think about the different ways that they even have, the different levers that they have to mitigate the situation, to report, etc. So thank you. That was very helpful to understand what it takes and what needs to shift this burden that you talked about. That is hugely helpful. Thank you so much, Aoife. I would have a million more questions for you, but looking at time, I would like to ask you one last before we are moving towards the official Q&A section. And my final question is another huge one, which is, can you talk a little bit about your key lessons from the overall process, your most important takeaway messages that you would like to convey and share with our participants here who are considering implementing a policy with a victim-centered approach towards zero tolerance, who are in the middle of it, who are at some point involved in the policy implementation process? What can you give them? Hope, tools, everything is very welcome and appreciated. Thank you, Aoife.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think kind of just to start off is that the only reason that I was able to do this work, or even that this work was able to take place, was because the National Women's Council funded it. So the importance of third sector organizations here is key, and the National Women's Council are incredible in Ireland. And that, I guess, leads into what I was going to say first, is that collaboration is key. Bringing everyone into the room as often as you can. Maybe it's a virtual room, maybe it's a physical room, and give them space to have a voice. If they're external agencies, if they're people within your community, and giving space to have a voice means really giving space to have a voice. So maybe that means bringing in an interpreter. Maybe that means doing it during work hours or during not working hours. So there's childcare facilities. Maybe it means it being a hybrid meeting, which is more complicated. Think about why it might be hard to get people in the room and then work against that to make it a more equitable space. I would also say that I love policy. Maybe I'm biased. Some people don't think policy is that important, but I think in especially the environment that we're living in right now, Policies and solidifying and implementing policies is really important. Get things on paper and get an agreement about them. And explicitly include marginalized people, include trans people, include people from migrant backgrounds, include people with disabilities, that these, while we can get them on paper, get them solid and fight for them. And I would also say that the last kind of piece is that there's work being done. Everywhere you go, there are people who are actually doing this work. So find them and listen to them and hear them and get their perspectives in the room. So that would be kind of my concluding perspectives.
Aoife, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Very empowering. Get the people who are already doing the work. That's a really wonderful conclusion to this. And with that, I'm looking at time. I would like to open the official Q&A part of our conversation. We have about 30 minutes. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat. I will read them out. Or raise your hand via the raise your hand function, and rest assured that your questions will not be included in the recording and will stay here. So please feel free and ask away. Both Aoife and I will be happy to answer any questions that might come up about the guide, about the process, about policy implementation.
Everyone is shy. That's okay. I'm not scary, would you believe? Yeah, if anyone has any questions, let me know. I also, yeah. Do we have any? Sorry. Oh, no, that's something else.
We have best wishes in the chat. And now I see a question that says, what tools do you suggest for monitoring?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I'm not going to say names, but thank you so much. Monitoring, I assume, and I guess you mean like around the kind of different behaviors, the transgressions. That's really interesting because, as I said before, we don't want to place impetus on victim survivors to have to make these kind of disclosures unless they wish to do so. So I do think that the Speak Out tool, and I can link to that as well, is a really great way for monitoring because not only can victim survivors make anonymous reports and then are set up with supports, people can make disclosures on behalf of victim survivor. Now, we find this really helpful anonymously. When I'm training people, because I do a lot of training in my work at the minute, and they meet with somebody and somebody tells them something, they make a disclosure and they say, okay, but I don't want to do anything about it. And then the person who receives the disclosure is left with, I know this thing and I'm really upset and I can't do anything because they don't want me to do anything and I have nowhere to put this. So they can make a report in the Speak Out tool that they received a disclosure. That's super helpful, not only for them as a supporter, but it provides kind of a little bit of institutional knowledge around what is actually going on the ground. So that's, I guess, one way of kind of low level monitoring, or kind of like base level monitoring. And I guess also speaking to people. Surveys are great if they're done well, on how people feel, what they have experienced. And maybe it's about roundtable discussions. Maybe it's about speaking specifically to organizations who represent marginalized communities within the institution about what their experiences are. And I mean, the classic monitoring tool is also a report, and making sure that people can make reports, that it's accessible to make reports. I adapted with the permission of the publishers, the Addressing Student Sexual Violence. I adapted a form to make what an example reporting form might look like. That's also important, having accessible reporting mechanisms and making sure that somebody is involved with and in charge of collecting that data, and that the data not only goes to the actual specific reports, but that the data is also collected.
Yeah, thank you so much. I see 3 questions in the chat. There is one that is an immediately related question, so I'm going to read that one out first. I find it difficult to balance offering low thresholds and multiple reporting points versus finding a way to collect data. Any advice regarding the number of reporting points?
Yeah, well, that's also, as I say, a challenge, and it is, as you say, kind of directly connected. There doesn't, I would say, need to be massive amounts of reporting points if, and I assume when you're saying reporting points, you're meaning people who a report can be made to or structures that a report can be made to. There doesn't need to be that many if there's a huge amount of advertising and institutional knowledge. So if everyone knows how the reporting procedure works, if it's accessible, if they feel like they can approach the reporting procedure, so maybe there's people of different genders and none working there, and they can work with interpreters and they can work with Braille, and it's accessible for all different kinds of people, then one really excellent reporting structure can be accessible for lots of different people. But that being said, disclosure response, so meeting disclosures of sexual violence or harassment or gender-based violence, they happen anywhere and all the time. So it's about making sure that the people who meet these disclosures feel equipped to then signpost to the reporting procedures. And we would always say that nobody should have to make a report unless they want to make a report. And this can feel counterintuitive to institutions because institutions always want to know what's going on. But victim survivors might not want to share for a multitude of reasons. So for me, from a victim survivor-centered approach, as long as a victim survivor is getting what they need regarding support and they don't want to make a report, then they don't have to. And that's difficult, but that's what we think, you know.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aoife. Thank you on pointing towards the fact that if highly advertised and broad structure, a single reporting point can be enough. Um, that is very helpful. I've got another question in the chat that is asking for some concrete suggestions on the practical implementation of a trauma-informed approach. How to build capacity and operationalizing the principle of trauma-informed and victim-centered approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Trauma informed is kind of a buzzword these days. It's kind of thrown around a lot. I think it's quite interesting because can investigations ever be truly trauma informed? I don't know that because the investigative process, trauma impacts memory, trauma impacts capacity, trauma impacts every single aspect of a victim survivor's life. So for an investigation to be truly trauma informed, it would have to take all of that into account. So things like evidence would be impacted very deeply because memory changes with trauma. So it's, I guess, it's about education around trauma. I think that it would be really key that all investigators get really good, robust trauma education about the neuropathology of trauma, how trauma impacts people, how collective trauma works. Institutional trauma is another aspect of trauma that is really important in this area. So the impact of the procedures on a person within an institution. When we speak about trauma-informed approach on a broad level, what we need to think about is how trauma affects a victim survivor and what that means for them in their daily life. So how it affects their ability to make a report, how it affects their ability to go to class, how it affects their ability to give lectures, and how we can mitigate that. And again, mitigation of that might not look like mitigation for the institution, and that's difficult. But if we do really want to center victim survivors, we have to listen to them and hear them and be really educated on trauma.
Yeah, thank you so much on touching on the one hand the robust trauma education and need for that, and on the other hand how I really appreciate how you bring in these different interests and approaches that might not always be aligned, a victim-centered perspective versus main institutional interests. I think that is really crucial, and also reminded me of what you said earlier about mitigating measures while a report is in process. That strikes me as very important.
Mm.
I see another question in the chat. When speaking of partnership structures, grassroots, a bottom-up approach, how much top-down help did you receive? Often bottom-up alone seems not to work. So this is relating back to the question of the different pressures that come in on an institution and what different leverage points you need. Yeah, top-down,
Yeah,
bottom-up. Is it something in between, Aoife?
I absolutely agree. It can feel like you're hitting a ceiling um, a lot of the time when you're doing bottom up. And it's something that I've experienced, and it's super frustrating. And I guess there's two kind of things to focus on there is like, how do you get buy-in? And you get buy-in by building relationships and by building impetus and to an extent seeing where they're coming from. Why do they feel that this is nothing to do with them? Why do they feel that this is nothing to do with the institution? Why do they feel like this is absolutely not their business? And maybe meeting them there and saying, okay, I can see why this makes sense, but this is also what's going on. So I guess that would also be one. And then when it gets frustrating and it gets tiring and it gets aggravating, it's about having community there. And community is so important around that kind of resilience of the many, the perspective of that we're all in this together. We believe in the good fight. Let's navigate how we can do this. What does it look like in a different institution? How did they do it? Can we get a meeting with their parties and our parties and get everyone in the room? But resilience is difficult when it feels like you're getting nowhere. But by having the conversations and by believing in it and by putting in the work day in, day out, you are getting somewhere.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. I think it's really key, and also something that I just see as a continuation of this work, how it's about building relationships.
Mhm.
That sounds really crucial to me.
And that's so much of what GenderSAFE is, which is incredible. You know, you guys are facilitating the space for the building of these and cross-community collaboration, which is so massive in this area. Yeah.
Huh? Thanks, Eva. I see another question in the chat, and after that, I see a hand up that I will come to. Hello, a participant says. I come from a highly international university with students coming from all over the world. How can we ensure that all victim survivors are heard out in our policies, given differing norms? Thank you for the great talk.
What an exciting challenge. That is an absolutely fair and valid perspective. I think that that's something that, again, makes things a little bit more difficult and that we have to face up to, that people come from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different perspectives on what gender-based violence is, on what sexual violence is, on how it should be met, on if it should be met. This is where I think the two go hand in hand. Education and cultural change is key. As soon as somebody enters an institution, that they feel like they can get information on the behavior that's accepted in the institution. So maybe that's workshops and classes, maybe that's campaigns, maybe that's constant advertising, just kind of creating that broad cultural acceptance of this is what we expect and this is what we believe in and this is why we believe in it, because we believe in equity and we believe in people's rights to access education in a safe and peaceable way, and this is how we believe that looks. So I guess for me there's absolutely no danger in saying that the Istanbul Convention says that this is the standard of behavior that is expected and we back that. You have a really great way, I guess, in that regard of saying this is the behavior that is tolerated and this is the behavior that is not tolerated. And then when somebody gets the education and they learn about what behavior is tolerated and not tolerated, if a breach happens, they've been told this has been created as an expectation. And I don't think that if somebody has access to the information, a lack of knowledge around that, it can be understandable, but it doesn't mean that it is okay. Is that helpful? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks. I think that's also pointing towards the larger cultural shift that we were
Mhm.
talking about. I have two more questions in the chat and one person who has their hand up. I'm just going chronologically. I'm going to read out the chat first. How can policy fight back organizational interests when it comes to gender-based violence? When the organization loses more when punishing the perpetrator, I think that's a big one. Aoife.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's massive. And they do have institutional interests. This is where it's really difficult if the institution inherently, or whatever capacity the institution is, doesn't believe in um, the fight, for want of a better expression. Um, Policy can help here if you can get a policy through that does. Then even if they don't actually believe in it, the individual actors or the institution, they have to because there's a policy. This is where the national framework was so helpful in Ireland because it actually didn't really matter the perspectives. They had to do it. Um, so I guess, yeah, it can be really helpful to have that kind of top up. And maybe it is about approaching kind of governments, actors within governments. We've got a really good community here of international practice. Maybe it's about pointing to international practice. But this is maybe where the business case comes in. And again, I said before, I don't like the business case, but the business case can help if people are business minded. There's a monetary, fiscal reason that although on the short term, it might be fiscally better to ignore, long term, if you've got things like Athena Swan, if you've got things like the reputational damage that it can cause, if/when it does get out, because these things get out, um, if you've got the knowledge that actors from other organizations, and like if we think about institutions, so much of institutional work is done by people moving between institutions. So saying, okay, well, actually, we're not going to get people from other institutions. We're not going to get the great lecturers. We're not going to get the great professors because they're not going to come here if this is not in place, and this is not adhered to. It's the carrot and the stick for encouragement to saying that this is something you have to believe in and it's something that you should believe in because it is, and it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aoife. I feel like what you're also pointing to is having these different tools and different
Mm.
arguments for different levels, and where it does indeed make sense to make a business case and convince people that prevention also is not just the right thing to do and will be of great support for victim survivors, but is also a fiscally more
Yeah.
rational decision. Yeah, thank you. I have one more question in the chat before I come to the person who has their hand up. How can a trauma-informed approach be ensured even when the procedure goes beyond the organizational context? When, for example, the victim survivors themselves are sued, for example, for defamation or another charge by the accused perpetrator who has faced an organizational sanction, for example, suspension.
Yeah, I mean,
Organization, yeah, can the
yeah.
organization then provide legal support to the victim survivors? And are there any similar cases that you could point to?
I can't point to a specific case in my mind. That's a really good question. I'm not going to give legal advice. My undergraduate in law.
Ooh, Aoife, your sound is off.
There, I think it's back now.
Okay.
Is it? Um, it's really hard. That's really hard. I don't know the answer there, but to be honest with you, that's exactly where the law can be weaponized by people to attack victim survivors. If the institution can say, well, actually, okay, that's interesting here because the institution says that they have had a finding, and then the person is saying that the finding is defamation. If the institution has robust policies that they can stand behind and they believe in, and they have backing within policies and procedures internationally, then they can stand behind that. So maybe kind of being really clear and delineating, say that although this counter process is happening, we stand by our investigation. We stand by the outcome of that investigation. Even if they can't say they explicitly stand with the victim survivor, they can say that they believe that they have done good practice and therefore they stand by the outcome of their investigation. It's weaponization of the law. That's weaponization of the law. And the law can be weaponized like anything else. So yeah, it's just about kind of standing behind the work, I guess. Yeah, that's really hard.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for still making a case that I think would be very important in these cases, that institutions um, are transparent about decisions being made in this
Yeah.
regard.
Yeah, exactly. And being able to say, well, we stand behind it. We're like, you can, that's okay, but we still back our decision.
Amazing. Thank you. Aoife, thank you so much for all of your great insights, for showing us what it takes to have a big bag of tricks, to understand
Yeah.
how to get policy implementation on its way. That was so helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone here, for your attention, for your great, insightful questions, for following the exit questionnaire and giving us feedback on how we can make this an even better educational experience. Please follow GenderSAFE on LinkedIn, sign up to the newsletter, and you will soon be able to see the recording of this session on the GenderSAFE YouTube channel. Thank you once again so much, Aoife, for all of your great work, for all of your incredible insights, and for being with us here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your time, everyone for your time, and GenderSAFE for being fabulous.
Thank you. Thanks. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.